Normandy, June 10, 1944. The morphine hadn't fully taken hold when Unteroffizier Klaus Richter understood he was dying. Blood pooled beneath his shattered leg, the left one torn open by shrapnel when the American artillery shell had found his foxhole 3 hours before dawn. The fabric of his Wehrmacht uniform had fused with burned flesh. Each shallow breath brought a taste of copper and soil. 22 years old, born in a village outside Dresden where his mother still waited for letters he could no longer write, Richter had spent the last 4 months convinced that capture meant execution. The propaganda films he'd watched in training barracks had been explicit. Anglo-Saxon barbarians tortured prisoners, gouged out eyes, castrated German soldiers, and left them to bleed out in fields. Now, as American voices grew louder beyond the hedgerow, he used his remaining strength to drag himself toward a crater, thinking only that he might die hidden, that his body might not be desecrated. The boot appeared first, brown leather, scuffed, too clean for a frontline soldier who'd been fighting for days. Then a face, young, maybe 19, eyes widening at the blood. Richter tried to speak, to beg, but his throat produced only a wet, clicking sound. The American, a medic, judging by the red cross on his helmet, shouted something incomprehensible, dropped to his knees, and began cutting away Richter's pant leg. Not slowly, not with the deliberate cruelty Richter had been taught to expect, but with frantic efficiency. A tourniquet appeared. Sulfa powder dusted the wound. Another medic arrived, then another. Within 6 minutes, Richter would later learn the exact time from the medical report, he was on a stretcher, morphine flooding his system, being carried toward a field hospital he couldn't see but could hear. Generators humming, men shouting coordinates, the organized chaos of an American medical operation that processed hundreds of casualties each day without distinguishing between the soldiers who wore eagles and those who wore stars. He woke on a surgical table, not in a tent, as he'd half expected, but in a requisitioned French barn that had been transformed into something approaching a sterile environment. Lights blazed overhead, electric lights powered by generators he could hear chugging outside. An American surgeon, mask pulled down to reveal a face lined with exhaustion, was explaining something to a nurse. Richter caught fragments. Arterial damage. Needs immediate intervention. Prep for amputation if... The words meant death, or worse than death. A future as a cripple, useless, a burden. In the German army, he'd seen what happened to men whose wounds made them unfit for further service. They were processed quickly, given minimal care, often left to manage their own pain with whatever they could scavenge. Resources went to soldiers who could return to combat. But the American surgeon didn't move on. He scrubbed again, called for more instruments, positioned himself over Richter's leg, with the concentration of a man attempting something difficult rather than something routine. The anesthesiologist, another American, this one older with gray streaking his temples, placed a mask over Richter's face and told him, in broken German, "Schlafen Sie. Wir reparieren. Sleep. We repair." The presumption that repair was possible, that an enemy's leg merited the effort, struck Richter as so absurd that he wanted to laugh. Then the ether took him under, and he tumbled into darkness, convinced he would wake without the leg, if he woke at all. He woke with the leg still attached, bandaged, immobilized, throbbing with a pain that the morphine dulled, but didn't eliminate, but attached. The surgeon had spent 4 hours reconstructing an artery, a nurse told him later. 4 hours on a German prisoner while American wounded waited in triage. It had been a command decision, she explained, because Richter's injury had been immediately life-threatening, and the American casualties could wait another 30 minutes without dying. The calculus was purely medical, not political. No one had asked whether saving a Wehrmacht soldier made strategic sense. This was Richter's first encounter with a system that would reshape his understanding of what a state owed even to its enemies. Over the following 18 months, as he moved through a series of American POW camps, first in France, then in England, finally across the Atlantic to a facility in rural Georgia, he would witness dozens of similar inversions. Moments when the reality of American military justice collided with everything Nazi propaganda had taught him about Anglo-Saxon barbarism. The camps themselves were shock enough. Richter arrived at Camp Wheeler, Georgia in August of 1944, part of a shipment of 378 German prisoners transported across the Atlantic on a Liberty ship that had been retrofitted with bunks and latrines. He'd expected squalor, the kind of conditions he'd seen in Soviet POW camps during his brief service on the Eastern Front, where German prisoners disappeared into labor battalions and emerged, if they emerged at all, as skeletal ghosts. Instead, he found himself in a compound of neat wooden barracks arranged around a central square, each building equipped with electric lighting, heating stoves for the coming winter, and latrines that actually functioned. The Red Cross had inspected the camp twice already, a fact the American commandant mentioned during the intake briefing as if it were completely ordinary that enemy soldiers should have advocates checking on their treatment. The rations were the second shock. Each prisoner received 2,800 calories daily, more than many German civilians were getting in Berlin by that point in the war. Breakfast brought oatmeal, powdered eggs, toast with margarine, coffee that tasted like burnt wood, but was at least hot and plentiful. Lunch featured meat, usually Spam or corned beef, occasionally fresh chicken, alongside potatoes, canned vegetables, bread. Dinner repeated the formula with variations. Sunday meals included dessert, canned peaches, chocolate pudding, sometimes even ice cream produced by the camp's own refrigeration unit. Men who had spent months on half rations in France, subsisting on black bread and ersatz coffee, found themselves gaining weight in captivity. Some prisoners, raised in the Depression-era poverty of Weimar Germany, had never eaten this well in their lives. But it was the legal framework, the meticulous, almost obsessive American adherence to rules even when those rules protected the enemy, that truly destabilized the German prisoner's worldview. The Geneva Convention wasn't a theoretical document at Camp Wheeler. It was posted in German translation on the wall of every barracks, its provisions explained during orientation by a German-speaking American officer who seemed genuinely concerned that the prisoners understand their rights. They had the right to refuse dangerous work, the right to receive mail and send letters home. Censored, yes, but sent. The right to complain about conditions through official channels. The right to elect a senior prisoner who would represent their interests to camp administration. The right to not be beaten, starved, or subjected to collective punishment. These weren't merely words. The camp operated an actual grievance system. Each barrack had a designated liaison, a German prisoner elected by his peers who met weekly with American officers to discuss conditions. Complaints were logged, investigated, resolved, or rejected with written explanations. When the kitchen began serving spoiled meat in September of 1944, the prisoners' formal protest resulted in a full inspection, the dismissal of 2 civilian contractors, and a written apology from the camp commandant. The very idea that American officers would apologize to German prisoners over the quality of their food seemed like evidence of some massive confusion, some bureaucratic error that would surely be corrected once higher authorities noticed. But the system held. And then came the incident that would become legendary among the German prisoners at Camp Wheeler, the trial of Private First Class Daniel Kowalski for the beating of Obergefreiter Hermann Vogel. The beating itself had been minor by Wehrmacht standards, a few blows with a rifle butt, a split lip, some bruising. Vogel, a former factory worker from Hamburg with a chronic knee injury that made him slow, had been on a work detail clearing brush from a fire road when he'd paused to rest. The guard, Kowalski, a 19-year-old from Pittsburgh with 3 months of military police training, had interpreted the pause as insubordination. Words had been exchanged. Vogel's English was minimal, Kowalski's German non-existent, and the situation had escalated. Kowalski had shouted. Vogel had shouted back. Kowalski had struck him twice across the shoulders with his rifle, then once across the face when Vogel had raised his hands defensively. The entire incident had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. In the German army, such an episode would have merited at most a reprimand for the guard if he'd caused injuries severe enough to prevent the prisoner from working. More likely, it would have been ignored entirely. Prisoners were expected to obey immediately and without question. Guards were expected to enforce obedience. Physical punishment was routine, accepted, barely worth documenting. But Hermann Vogel had been in American custody long enough to understand that different rules applied here. Back in his barracks, he'd mentioned the incident to his liaison, Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, a career soldier who'd been captured at Normandy and who'd already successfully filed 3 complaints about work conditions. Hoffmann, skeptical but curious, had helped Vogel document everything: the time, the location, the names of the other prisoners who'd witnessed it, a description of the injuries. They'd submitted the complaint through official channels, expecting it to disappear into some bureaucratic void. Instead, an investigation began. Within 2 days, a captain from the camp's legal office arrived to interview Vogel. The captain brought an interpreter, a German-American corporal, whose accent placed him somewhere in the Rhineland, and spent 40 minutes taking Vogel's statement. He wanted details, exact words exchanged, precise description of the blows, location of bruises. He photographed the injuries. He interviewed the other prisoners who'd been present. He reviewed the work detail logs. He questioned Kowalski himself. The German prisoners watched all this with mounting disbelief. They were accustomed to military justice, but military justice in the Wehrmacht meant officers protecting their men, means closing ranks against outsiders, meant dismissing complaints from prisoners as inherently unreliable. Yet here were American officers investigating an American soldier based solely on the testimony of enemy combatants. Here was a captain spending hours on a case that, by any Wehrmacht standard, wasn't a case at all. When the word came down that Kowalski would face a summary court-martial, the disbelief turned to something approaching awe. The trial took place on October 3, 1944, in a classroom building that had been converted into a temporary courtroom. The presiding officer was a major with legal training, flanked by 2 captains who would serve as panel members. Kowalski stood at attention in his dress uniform, looking younger than his 19 years, while a military lawyer, assigned to him at no cost, another detail that stunned the watching Germans, presented his defense. The prosecution called Vogel as a witness. Through the interpreter, Vogel described the incident again, his voice steady, his eyes fixed on some point above the major's head. He'd been coached not to editorialize, not to inject emotion, simply to report facts. The defense attorney tried to discredit him, suggested that Vogel had been malingering, that the language barrier had created misunderstandings, that a guard in a combat zone had to maintain discipline. But the physical evidence supported Vogel's account: photographs showing bruises consistent with rifle butt impacts, witness statements from 2 other prisoners who'd seen the same thing, medical documentation of the split lip. Kowalski himself, under questioning, admitted to striking Vogel, but claimed it had been necessary to maintain order. The major deliberated for 20 minutes. Then he delivered the verdict: guilty of assault against a prisoner of war, violation of the Articles of War governing treatment of enemy combatants. Kowalski was sentenced to 45 days of hard labor, reduction in rank to private, and a formal letter of reprimand that would remain in his service record permanently. His military career, such as it was, had effectively ended over 90 seconds of lost temper and 2 blows with a rifle. For the German prisoners who'd followed the case, and by that point everyone in the camp had heard about it, the verdict landed like a mortar shell. They'd been raised in a system where might made right, where the strong dominated the weak without legal consequence, where the concept of rights for prisoners of war was considered sentimental Anglo-Saxon weakness. Many of them had participated in or witnessed far worse: the casual shooting of Soviet prisoners who couldn't keep pace on forced marches, the starvation of captured partisans, the systematic brutality that characterized the Eastern Front. They'd been taught that such treatment was not merely acceptable but necessary, that enemies deserved no consideration, that mercy was dangerous naivety. Now they were confronting a system that punished its own soldiers for relatively minor violence against those same enemies. A system where a German prisoner's testimony could end an American's career. A system that seemed to genuinely believe that law should govern even the treatment of defeated opponents. The shockwaves from Kowalski's court-martial rippled through the camp for months. Prisoners debated it endlessly, in barracks after lights out, during work details, in letters they wrote home that would never make it past censors who flagged such politically sensitive material. Some interpreted it as weakness, proof that America was too soft to win wars, too concerned with legal niceties to do what was necessary. Others saw it as strength, evidence of a civilization so confident in its values that it could afford to extend legal protections even to enemies who wouldn't have reciprocated. A few, mostly older prisoners who'd lived through Weimar and remembered when Germany had briefly experimented with democratic governance, recognized it as something they'd lost and hadn't fully appreciated until now. Klaus Richter, his leg still healing from the surgery that should never have happened, found himself in this last category. He'd been thinking about the surgeon who'd spent 4 hours reconstructing his artery, about the medical system that had treated him as a human being rather than disposable enemy material. Now he was watching that same logic extend into the legal realm, the idea that rules existed not as tools for the powerful, but as protections for everyone, including those who'd worn the wrong uniform. It forced uncomfortable questions. If Americans could put their own soldiers on trial for harming German prisoners, what did that say about the German state that had never contemplated such accountability? If a Wehrmacht guard had beaten a captured American, would there have been an investigation, a trial, consequences? Richter knew the answer. He'd seen how Soviet prisoners were treated, had heard the stories from Poland and France and Russia. The contrast between those memories and his current reality created a cognitive dissonance he couldn't resolve. Other cases followed, each one reinforcing the pattern. In November, a sergeant faced court-martial for withholding Red Cross parcels from prisoners, a relatively minor infraction that nonetheless resulted in reduction in rank and reassignment. In January of 1945, 2 privates were convicted of theft after stealing possessions from newly arrived prisoners during intake processing. Both received dishonorable discharges. In March, an officer was reprimanded for assigning prisoners to work details that exceeded Geneva Convention limits on hours and physical demands. The German prisoners kept track, compared notes, tried to find exceptions that would prove the system was for show. But the exceptions didn't materialize. The American military justice system, for all its flaws and inconsistencies, appeared to genuinely believe that soldiers could and should be held accountable for crimes against prisoners of war. It wasn't perfect. Punishments varied, some cases were dismissed on technicalities, and there were undoubtedly incidents that went unreported, but the framework existed, functioned, and produced real consequences. For men who'd been raised under National Socialism, this was profoundly destabilizing. Nazi ideology had taught them a hierarchy of humanity. Aryans at the top, then various gradations of lesser peoples, with enemies occupying the lowest rungs. In that system, the very concept of legal protections for enemies made no sense. You didn't owe justice to subhumans. You owed them only what served your strategic interests. The strong took what they wanted. The weak endured what they must. Law existed to formalize the will of the leader, not to constrain it. American military justice seemed to operate from different premises entirely. It assumed that even enemies had certain inviolable rights, that power came with responsibilities, that officers who violated these principles deserved punishment regardless of whether the victims were friends or foes. It was a system built on the radical notion that humans possessed inherent dignity that transcended national allegiance. The transformation wasn't instant or universal. Many prisoners remained committed Nazis, interpreting American leniency as weakness to be exploited rather than virtue to be admired. Some clung to the propaganda they'd internalized, finding ways to dismiss evidence that contradicted it. Others simply went through the motions, taking advantage of better conditions while maintaining their ideological convictions intact. But for a significant number, men like Klaus Richter, whose leg had been saved by a surgeon who had no strategic reason to save it, who'd watched American justice defend a German prisoner against an American guard, the experience became impossible to ignore. They began noticing other things, the camp library stocked with books, including some by authors the Nazis had banned. The educational classes offered to prisoners who wanted them. The way American officers generally addressed them with professional courtesy rather than contempt. The mail system that, despite delays and censorship, actually delivered letters from home and sent letters back. The regular Red Cross inspections that prisoners could participate in anonymously, reporting grievances without fear of retaliation. These men started writing different kinds of letters home, letters that raised questions their censors found troubling enough to confiscate. They began asking themselves why. If Germany represented the pinnacle of civilization as they'd been taught, German military justice didn't extend similar protections to its own prisoners. They wondered what it meant that the decadent democracies they'd been ordered to crush seemed more concerned with human dignity than the thousand-year Reich that was supposed to save humanity from itself. The questions grew sharper as the war ground toward its conclusion, and news from Germany became increasingly grim. By April of 1945, even the most censored versions of events couldn't hide the truth. Germany was collapsing, cities were burning, the Reich was dying. In Camp Wheeler, prisoners gathered around radios to hear updates, their faces growing longer as the reality set in. Some still talked about wonder weapons and inevitable victory. Others had stopped pretending. When news came of Hitler's death and Germany's surrender, the camp fell into a strange silence. Men who'd spent years fighting for a cause that had defined their entire adult lives now had to confront its complete annihilation. Some wept. Some raged. Some simply sat in stunned disbelief, trying to process a world where everything they'd fought for had turned to ash. And in that moment of collapse, the contrast became unavoidable. They were learning of their nation's death while living under conditions more humane than anything they'd experienced in Germany's service. They were receiving news of total defeat while eating better than they had during their supposed triumphs. They were facing the end of their world while protected by legal systems that their own government had never bothered to establish. Klaus Richter, walking now with only a slight limp thanks to months of physical therapy the camp's medical staff had provided, found himself thinking about that surgeon again. The man had never asked whether Richter deserved to keep his leg. He'd simply done his job, applying his skill to a medical problem without regard for politics or nationality. He'd treated healing as a technical challenge rather than a moral question. And in doing so, he demonstrated something Richter was only now beginning to understand. That civilization wasn't about power or racial superiority or ideological purity. It was about the systems you built to constrain power, protect the vulnerable, and ensure that even in war, some baseline of human dignity survived. The repatriation process began in late 1946. Prisoners who'd been held in American camps started returning to a Germany they barely recognized, partitioned, occupied, reduced to rubble and starvation. Many found their hometowns destroyed, their families dispersed or dead, their futures completely uncertain. They returned carrying memories of captivity that complicated the simple narratives their new authorities wanted to tell about American brutality and German suffering. Some prisoners spoke openly about their treatment, describing the food, the medical care, the legal protections. Others stayed silent, unwilling to complicate the post-war politics of victimhood and denazification. A few wrote memoirs, though most of these wouldn't be published until decades later, when the political climate had shifted enough to allow nuanced discussions of the war. Hermann Vogel, the prisoner whose testimony had helped convict Private Kowalski, returned to Hamburg to find his wife remarried, his factory job gone, his entire life disrupted. But he kept the paperwork from the court-martial, the official documentation that an American military court had taken his word over that of an American soldier, that a system had functioned on his behalf, even when he was its enemy. Years later, interviewed for an oral history project, he would describe it as the moment he understood that justice could be something more than the strong dominating the weak. Klaus Richter made it back to Dresden in early 1947, his mother having miraculously survived the firebombing and the Soviet occupation. He found work as a clerk, married, had children, lived a quiet life. But he never forgot the surgeon whose name he'd never learned, the man who'd spent 4 hours saving a leg that belonged to an enemy soldier. When Richter's grandson asked him 60 years later what the war had taught him, he struggled to articulate it. Finally, he said, "I learned that the people we were told to hate treated us better than our own leaders did. I learned that law matters more than power. I learned that we were on the wrong side. It was a lesson purchased at tremendous cost, to the millions who died, to the civilization nearly destroyed, to the prisoners themselves whose youth had been consumed by a criminal regime. The American POW camp system wasn't perfect. It had its failures, its cruelties, its injustices. Some prisoners were mistreated, some guards escaped accountability. The system itself existed within a broader context of total war that produced atrocities on all sides. But for men who'd been raised to believe that might made right, that enemies deserved no consideration, that power required no justification, the experience of being protected by American military courts, of watching their captors punish their own soldiers for violations of prisoners' rights, of living under a legal framework that seemed to genuinely value human dignity above strategic convenience, was nothing short of revolutionary. They had expected revenge. They received regulations. They had expected arbitrary cruelty. They received appeals processes. They had expected to be treated as subhuman enemies. They received medical care, adequate food, legal protections, and the shocking revelation that a democratic state could be strong enough to constrain even its own power, confident enough to extend rights even to those who'd sought to destroy it. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt itself as a democracy, many of these former prisoners would look back on their time in American camps as the moment their political education truly began. They'd learned, against all their expectations and much of their will, that the civilization they'd fought to destroy had something their own had lacked: the understanding that justice, to mean anything, must apply even to enemies, especially to enemies. It was a lesson the 21st century would need to relearn again and again, as new conflicts and new hatreds tested whether democratic societies could maintain their principles under pressure. The question those German prisoners had confronted, whether a state could be both strong and just, both victorious and lawful, remained as urgent as ever. Their answer, reluctant and hard-won, suggested that strength without justice was ultimately weakness, that power without constraint was self-defeating, that the truest test of civilization was how it treated those completely in its power. They had been protected by their enemies' courts. And in that protection they'd found the seeds of a different kind of society, one built not on domination, but on law, not on racial hierarchies, but on shared humanity, not on the will of leaders, but on the consent of the governed. It hadn't saved them from their war, but it had offered them in defeat something their victory could never have provided: the possibility of redemption, the chance to build something better, the understanding that even in humanity's darkest moments, some light could survive. The courts that saved them had been enemy courts. That was precisely the point.